welcome to tonight's installment of the Jess Usher Memorial Lecture Series. My name is Mark Johnson. I'm Assistant Vice President for Academic Affairs. And it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Amy Warren. One of several reasons why it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Warren is because before she completed the dissertation, I had a chance from which this study is drawn. I had a chance to read it, and from reading it, or not all of it, part of it, but from reading it and having conversations with her, a few of those, and then going and doing some of my own research, it changed my perspective on epigenetics. I'd read a bit about it before, but I held the theory in pretty low esteem initially. The reason for that was because from the stuff that I'd read, it seemed kind of like a resurrection of Lamarckianism and kind of tinged with a little bit of Lysenkoism. What I mean by that is that the theory of inherited traits was, a competing theory for Darwin's natural selection, and it kind of fell out of favor a long time ago. It was reborn during the Soviet era for sort of ideological and political reasons. So some of the stuff that I read was, I was thinking it was moving in that same direction for the same reasons. However, after these conversations, like I said, it changed my perspective. And now, I believe, not as a biologist, no, I'm not a biologist, but I'm a student of kind of the history of the production and dissemination of knowledge. And now I believe that this theory does a really good job of helping us understand the really, really complex relationship between our inherited DNA and the ever-changing environment in which we humans find ourselves in, generation after generation. I think Amy tonight is going to talk more about the application of this, but I found this very, very interesting. And following Socrates, I feel like we're always indebted to those people who lead us to knowledge and understanding. So I hope you enjoy tonight's talk as much as I did. So moving on to the person, from the topic to the person, a Tifton native and a graduate of Tift County High School, Amy Walker Warren received her BS degree in early childhood education from Florida State in 1999 and her MS degree there in 2000. After graduating, she worked for FSU's Center for Prevention and Early Intervention Policy as a resource teacher and later as the education coordinator for the center's Early Head Start program. In 2006, now with a couple of children, toddlers of her own, Amy returned to Tifton and in 2007 became a faculty member in the education department. During this time, she continued to do contract work for Florida State as an infant and toddler specialist trainer. In 2018, she completed a graduate certificate in program evaluation from Florida State and expanded her role at ABAC to include Director of Institutional Assessment, and she was promoted to Associate Professor as well. During this time, she also played an instrumental role in the development of our educational preparation program, which led to the Ag Ed bachelor degree. In 2022, she completed her PhD in early childhood education from Florida State and was soon thereafter promoted to full professor. Amy's research interests include adverse childhood experiences, bioadjacent perspectives on epigenetics and the transmission of trauma, infant and toddler development, program assessment, measurement of student learning outcomes, instructional pedagogy in higher education, and more. So please help me extend a warm welcome for tonight's speaker, Amy Warren.
So, good evening, and thank y'all for being here. So first I do want to say, or just admit perhaps, that I'm nervous, and so I have tools up here with me. One of them, of course, is my notes, and that's going to let me stay on topic and not wander off. Another is water, so that you don't have to hear my lips stick to my teeth. And the third thing is I wore heels, and the reason for that was to make it very hard for me to bolt out the back door while Dr. Johnson was introducing me just then. But all that aside, we are going to start tonight talking about adverse childhood experiences. That's the beginning. That's the base level. And I promise you, even though adverse childhood experiences doesn't sound a whole lot like, a party topic or anything like that, it is actually a very interesting and exciting topic. And in a lot of ways, I find it absolutely fascinating. So we're going to start with the basics. We're going to start with, maybe if I can make this work. There. All right. So we're going to start with adverse childhood experiences. And I'm not going to tell you a whole lot about it before we begin, because when we start, I want to begin by giving you the survey exactly as it was originally worded back in 1998 when it was first designed by Vincent Felitti and Robert Anda. And they distributed a survey through Kaiser Permanente, which is a healthcare entity, probably one of the largest in the United States. And they distributed this survey to over 17,000 people across the United States. Actually, they distributed it to about 25,000 and got 17,000 responses, a little over 17,000 responses. And so I want to give you the opportunity to determine your ACE score. Now, the reason for that is as we move forward in the conversation tonight, that's going to give you a little bit of personal perspective about maybe some of the data and numbers that I'm going to give you. It'll at least give you a frame of reference when you consider how maybe your own numbers measure up against national populations in the original data, but also as we move into my own study and own research, it'll give you some numbers so that you can compare maybe your own score with those that were originally reported by Kaiser Permanente and Felitti and Anda, but also in comparison to the justice-involved teen moms that I was looking at scores on. So the way this is going to work is, how many of you are familiar with TikTok and you've seen put a finger up if, that ... game that people play on TikTok? And we're going to do it similar to that. And basically, I'm going to put 10 questions up on the screen, one at a time. And as you read each question, you're going to ask yourself, did any part of this question, is the answer to this question yes for me, and did it occur before my 18th birthday? If the answer is yes, you're going to secretly put a finger up, or just kind of, you can keep your arms crossed and just make a mental note. The point is not to share your score with anybody. The point is not to tell me. I'm not going to ask you what your score is. This is strictly for your own knowledge. I don't see any children in the room, so I don't mind reading them out loud. But originally, I thought if I looked around and saw somebody young, I was just going to make you read them for yourself. But in case somebody can't see this far, I'll read them aloud. So I'll put each one up on the screen. If the answer to any part of the question is yes, just keep track of a finger. And then at the end, we'll add them all up, and then you will know your score. All right, you ready? Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you or insult you, put you down or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? Number 2, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks and were injured? Three, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touched their body in a sexual way, or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? 4, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? Your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? 5, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you? Or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced, or did you lose a parent to death? That was added in 2004. 7, was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes, often, or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or knife? 8, did you live with anyone who is a problem drinker or alcoholic or use street drugs? 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? 10, did a household member go to prison? Okay, it says, what's your score? That is not a question I actually intend for you to answer out loud, but it's just something I want you to make a mental note of. Like I said, as we move forward, the first few studies we're going to talk about are not directly about ACEs, but they are related, and you'll see in a little bit. But once we get to further studies down the road, you'll see that your ACE score kind of will give you a frame of reference for some of the other things that we talk about. So the study that was done where they sent out this particular survey that you just completed, and now you know your score, was a seminal work. It's basically the biggest study that was ever done or had been done at the time on one of the largest health populations that was trying to look at the connections between childhood trauma, things that occur before your 18th birthday, and health outcomes. And these are some of the findings from that study. 60% of the people who responded, out of the 17,000, reported having at least one. 20% had experienced 3 or more. The third bullet point is something I always found really interesting. The more ACEs a person experienced, the more likely you were to have a negative health outcome. But the catch is, it doesn't matter which of the 10. It's not that somebody who had an incarcerated parent was going to have worse health outcomes. What really mattered was the number, how many. The greater the risk, the more traumas, the more likely you were to have these negative health outcomes. Reporting 4 or more ACEs, so having a score of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, significantly increased the likelihood of heart disease. It increased the likelihood of diabetes, of stroke, mental health disorders, substance abuse, and these were just the main ones. The list was actually extensively long. And high ACE scores also increased the likelihood that a person would abuse alcohol, would smoke, have drug use, be obese, and would be promiscuous or engage in risky sexual behavior. So why does this happen, though? How can there be a relationship between things that happened to you as a child and then flash forward to your adult years and all of a sudden your health begins to show signs or show wear and tear, and they make direct correlations back to things that happened when you were little? How can that be? And as research has moved forward, one of the things that has come to light is the idea that Dr. Johnson mentioned, and that's epigenetics. I think it is absolutely fascinating. So epigenetics is the study of how our DNA is expressed, and it's actually part of an amazing system in our bodies. And these changes that occur in our bodies, they adapt our system to live in a world based on the experiences that we have had. Basically, it changes the way our DNA is expressed to prepare our children to live in a similar type of environment. It's pretty cool. I'll do a better job of explaining that in a minute. So, again, why does this happen? How do we know? We can't really go do experiments on people. We can't take a bunch of babies and expose them to trauma and then wait until they become adults and do further tests. We don't do research like that on humans. So we have to use existing populations for this kind of stuff. And one of the first big studies that began to examine these ideas around epigenetics were based off of the Dutch hunger winter. If you recognize the time period, 1944, 1945, what was going on then? Yeah, World War II. So, during this time period, 44 and 45, there was an incredibly harsh winter. And the Netherlands was suffering from a devastating famine that was being caused by food being blockaded from some of the military tactics. And thousands upon thousands, and I read some numbers, it was over 20,000 or so people who actually died from starvation during this time period because of those food blockades in the Netherlands. Pregnant women who survived during this time period, they endured severe malnutrition, and they gave birth to children later who had lasting effects from that malnutrition. Now, many of the pregnant women actually, wound up miscarrying. But those who did not miscarry wound up having babies whose genetic markers had actually been altered. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. I need this. William, where is the cursor? Well, I may have found it. I think I did. I think I found it. So, basically, the idea from the original studies are looking at the survivors, the pregnant women during this Dutch hunger winter. I might not need this. Okay. Yep. So the idea was that when we experience an event that is serious enough or traumatic enough to send signals to our genes that basically says, hey genes, hey guys, that was really, really serious, and to be better biologically prepared for that in the future, for us and for future children, we're going to need to make a few changes to our blueprint, to our DNA. Now, we're not actually going to remove DNA from our sequence, but we are going to make adjustments to how our DNA is expressed. So, if the changes that are made as your body reacts to these kinds of things, if they only affect tissue, like in your brain, then we may see the results of those changes in the actual person who experienced that trauma. But if the changes occur to parts of our DNA that control whole systems, we are less likely to see those changes in ourselves. Those changes are going to show up in our offspring, and actually also in our grandchildren. So when we have a child, we contribute our blueprints, our DNA, half of DNA from the mom, half of DNA from the dad. We contribute our blueprints to the making of the child. And those changes that our body noted early on now have an opportunity to be put to use. And so those changes that were intended to better prepare us for certain types of situations are now a reality for our children. A problem, however, can arise, such as in the Dutch hunger winter. If the child with this genetic change is not born into an environment where they can put that change to use, then the change might result in the child having a physical, behavioral, or emotional characteristic that doesn't fit into the situation the child is in. So what does that mean? In the case of the Dutch hunger winter, an epigenetic change had equipped those babies' bodies to hold on to calories to prepare them for times of hunger. But the famine ended in 1945, and ultimately those babies didn't grow up in times of starvation. The epigenetic change meant to help them survive, made them more likely to be obese, have type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and high blood pressure. But it gets even more fascinating, and this is the part where I become a nerd. Okay, well, that happened a few minutes ago, but still. So there was another really interesting idea that came out of this study and the research that was originally done by Lumi. And he wound up spending about 70 years, the entire rest of his career, studying and looking at the survivors and their offspring and their grandchildren. The grandchildren of the pregnant women, so not the pregnant woman herself, and not the child that she was pregnant with, but the grandchildren of the pregnant women that were carrying female babies. So the women who were pregnant, if they were pregnant with a female baby, it was found that those female babies, when they had their own children, they were smaller. Their babies were smaller at birth. Now, just think about what that means. When a woman is pregnant, things that happen to her during her pregnancy can make changes to her baby's DNA. However, that little girl, if she is pregnant with a girl, already has every egg on board that she will ever produce. And so the changes to the DNA will be expressed in not just the baby that the woman is pregnant with, but they're also going to show up in her offspring, in the grandchildren, in the subsequent generations. We call that type of leap intergenerational trauma, transition of trauma, because the changes carry out multiple generations, not just on the person that experienced it. So the next step to this came a little later. This study was done by Rachel Yehuda, and she started her work in 2014 and continues to publish pretty prolifically on the subject. But she initially looked at the survivors of the Holocaust. And using the research that had previously been done on hunger winter survivors, she and her team studied people who survived the Holocaust as children. So they went through the Holocaust, it was very hard for them, and they were children during that time. And then she also looked at their offspring. So it was the Holocaust, there were children. Those children grew up years later. The war has now ended. And so she was looking at children born after the war ended, long after their parents grew up, and the things that happened to their parents when they were very young during the Holocaust. Their research was the first to show changes to DNA at a molecular level. They were able to document the changes in the proteins that turn genes on and turn genes off, protein methylation and demethylation. Interestingly, when scientists looked at their DNA, they found that the survivors' genes were primed for bigger responses to stress. So the children who actually survived it, their genes had been turned on to respond to stress in big ways. But their children, who were born much later, after the war was over, after things were settled, they were born with the opposite. Their genes were ready to show low levels of response stress. The children and grandchildren of the survivors were later found to have much higher rates of depression and PTSD, even though they weren't conceived when the Holocaust occurred. During the Holocaust, the survivors' bodies had programmed the hardship experiences into their DNA, and those signals were passed on to their children. And even though the children never experienced the Holocaust, their bodies carried those shadows. It's kind of proof that the past doesn't always stay in the past. So, my research. If experiences of trauma can be biologically passed down through generations, then what happens when trauma occurs during some of the most vulnerable years of development, childhood and adolescence? And if a mother already carries the shadows from her own parents and grandparents, as well as the echoes of her own hardships, how might that shape the emotional and social world of the baby she brings, the emotional and social development of the baby she brings into the world? So, building on this understanding, my own research specifically examined the relationship between traumatic experiences in adolescent mother's childhood and the social and emotional development of her baby. So, this is essentially what I was looking at. I specifically chose a population of incarcerated teen mothers and their babies. Now, these teen mothers were part of a project or a program that had been implemented in parts of Florida. Originally, Florida law said that if a girl was involved in the foster care system and she was incarcerated or arrested and she became pregnant, because the girl was already a ward of the state, when her baby was born, it automatically became a ward of the state and was automatically taken from her. That went on for decades. So we had these young girls, younger than the age of 18, and simply because they were younger than the age of 18, their babies were automatically taken away if they were involved in these court-type systems. But through progress and a lot of work by some really invested people, they created something in Florida that is now pretty much in about the 6 biggest counties. They call it baby court. And these mothers, what happens now is if they will agree to participate in a very specific home visiting program, then when they have their baby, they are allowed to keep their baby as long as they agree to meet with a trained, licensed home visitor once a week. The home visits usually last an hour and a half, and the relationship between the two is a lot about parenting and supporting your baby and follow up on medical appointments and things like that. So if the mothers will agree to have that type of support, then the state will allow them to keep their baby while they are still working out probation, and even though they may in some cases be 11, 12, 15 years old. So in my study, I was able to use 132 pairs, 132 mother-baby pairs. There were, of the babies, there were 65 females and 67 males. It was really lucky. There was pretty much almost an even split. The mothers, the youngest mother that I looked at, she was 11, and the oldest was 17. Many of the mothers already had more than one child, but I only used one child per mother, and I used the youngest child. So whoever her first child was, that was the baby I used. But 9 of the mothers, I think, had 4 or more children already. So the things I looked at. Self-reported ACE scores of the teen mother. The teen mothers were given the ACE survey to complete completely on their own. The exact same questions I asked you at the beginning to determine your ACE score, they were given those exact same questions and they scored it themselves. So that was one number I used and looked at. Another number I looked at was the number of the home visitor who would score the ACEs survey on behalf of the teen mother. So the home visitors visited the teens, like I told you, and as the mother shared things about her life with the home visitor kept an ACEs survey record in her file. And when the teen would disclose something that had happened to her in childhood or talk about something that was relevant to a conversation she was having, but it checked off one of the survey questions, then they kept a running record. So there was also a home visitor score for the teen mother. And then I also looked at the baby's social and emotional development. Now, that particular score came from a tool called the Ages and Stages Questionnaire, Social and Emotional, and it specifically looks at social and emotional skills of babies, I think it goes up to 60 months, but I was only looking at babies from 2 months to 24 months. I really wanted to see those youngest babies. So the reason social emotional development was the area I focused on was because early social and emotional skills are the foundation for all other development. Babies who have issues with social and emotional development, 90% of the time or more, are likely to have issues in other developmental domains. Social emotional development in very young children looks like curiosity. It looks like being creative. It looks like understanding boundaries. It looks like babies who can pull themselves back together in a reasonable amount of time when their mom has told them no. It looks like babies who have tantrums at 2 because that's a normal thing for toddlers to do. It looks like typical development. All of these things are critical parts of children becoming successful in school. Kids who aren't curious don't ask questions in school. And kids who aren't emotionally well put together struggle later on, whether it's in cognitive issues, whether it's in language issues. Social emotional development undergirds all of that. So, here's what I found. These are just the descriptive statistics, but 24% of these babies scored at risk socially and emotionally. That's a pretty big number. We usually don't expect to see in any given population more than 10%, and even that is iffy. That's just those at risk, not necessarily those that would score into risk. But in this case, 24% of the babies were already showing issues, even by the age of 2, socially and emotionally. And there were some differences between boys and girls. So obviously you can tell, if you can read this, the green part is not at risk, and the magenta is risk. So males were more likely to be at risk socially and emotionally than females were, these female babies. Now, in terms of ACE scores, the average ACE score that the teens reported for themselves was 3.15, so about 3. The average home visitor score, ACE, was 5.8, so about 6. So think about your own ACE score that you did for yourself at the beginning. For these teen girls, they reported, when the survey was given to them, an average of score of about 3. But the home visitor scores, they were about 6. The average score in the original ACE study for nationwide was a 2.2, so an average score of 2. And this is some of the data when I compared the teen scores to the home visitor scores. And the thing to me that is so interesting is that the blue bars are what the teen reported for herself. The red bars are what the home visitor scored. And you can see there are opposite things going on. So the teens reported, the vast majority of them put that they only had a score of 1 or 2. But the majority of home visitors put the teen scores at an 8, 9, or 10. So as you can see, fewer teen mothers self-reported higher ACE scores than were reported by the home visitors. 48 of the young mothers had ACE scores of 8 or higher, according to the home visitors surveys. That's a huge number. So putting all those pieces together. For each additional 1, so if you had a score of 2, every time the score went up by just 1 point, a teen mother, or for a teen mother's score to go up just by 1, her baby was 30% more likely to have social and emotional difficulties. And that 30% happened for every additional 1. So if you just go from 2 to 3, that's 30%. If you go from 3 to 4, you are now at 60% more likely. For every additional 1, it was 30% more likely to have issues. It didn't matter which of the 10, just if you had an additional 1. For each additional one that was reported by the home visitor, her child was more than twice as likely to have social and emotional difficulties. So we can see the effects of this trauma and the cumulative effect, the compounding effect by adding additional adversity onto these young teens was being played out in their children. Now, because I see students in here and because Suzanne Smith said that she was going to ask some of her students to come or at least put a sign-up sheet so they could get extra credit, I decided to include some of the research I have done here at ABAC with ACEs and ABAC students. So, for several years, I worked with students doing undergraduate research, and we were specifically looking at ACEs in the ABAC student population. And so I thought y'all might find some of that interesting to hear what ABAC students' numbers were. Now, in those studies, we were looking at ACE scores in general for ABAC students, but we were also looking at the relationship between that and the likelihood of them engaging in risk-taking behaviors. So the students wanted to see if there was an ACE score that was related to the likelihood that students were going to engage in some of these risky things. We had, in the first round, over 600 responses to our survey. I think in total there were a little over 800, but by the time we called, there were over 600 usable responses from students. And in the second round, I think there were 540. So given that there are about 3,500 students, that's a pretty good representative sample. And this is what we found of those that responded. So 0 ACEs, so the biggest portion by far. 1 ACE and 2 ACEs was about 50%, which falls right in line with what we expect to see from the original ACE survey. But it was about 20% of the students had 4 or more. And that's actually a little bit higher than we would expect to see in the general population. And then we broke it out by gender, male and female. So the females are blue and the males are orange. And you can see that males reported much higher rates of having no adversity or no ACEs at all. And then females, theirs remained pretty steady. And these were the types of things that we compared their ACE scores to. So, risky sexual behavior, prescription drug use, illicit drug use, and suicidal tendencies. Males who had 3 or more ACEs over 50% of them were engaging in risky sexual behavior. Males, 40% were engaging in prescription drug use, and these are the males with 3 or more ACEs. Males with 3 or more ACEs, 70% of them illicit drugs. And I'm pretty sure on the survey that they actually excluded marijuana from the list. It was drugs that were not prescribed to them, cocaine, pills, those kinds of things, and clarified that marijuana was not part of that particular one. Males with 2 or more ACEs, only 20% were reporting that they were using illicit drugs. So you can see there's some kind of connection here. And males with 3 or more ACEs, 70% reported some type of suicidal tendencies or ideation, versus only 10% of males who had 2 or less. That's pretty scary stuff for college students. This is what that looked like for female students. So for females with 3 or more ACEs, over 40% of them were engaging in risky sexual behavior. The yellow bar again for prescription drug abuse for females with 3 or more ACEs, about 18%. 36% of the 3 or more ACEs for females were using illicit drugs, and about 65% of the girls with 3 or more reported suicidal tendencies. So we can clearly see again, the more ACEs you have, it increases these risk-taking behaviors. The thing that I think continued to get me was a lot of the people who were responding to this weren't yet even 18. So they hadn't even fully gotten to the age where they would stop counting things towards their ACE score. There was still time, in some cases, for them to get older and add additional ACEs to their survey. I've talked at you a lot, but do you have any questions? Yeah. There's a very big difference. And I wound up studying it for a long time, but really it all boils down to the fact that many teens, and that changes a little bit as they mature, do not recognize their own trauma. And one of the things that came to light through conversations I had and interviews I did before actually starting this study, I interviewed many of these moms and spent time with them. And an example is I was talking to one of the moms, the teen moms, and she was just telling me about her life and things that happened, and she told me that when she was very young, there would be times when her mom would need to buy groceries and they wouldn't have any money. And so her mom would take her to go play with men. And then the men would pay her mom, and her mom could go get groceries. And my response to that, I just said, "I'm so sorry that happened to you." And she said, "What? Why? We had to eat." And so her own understanding of what had occurred in her life was very, very different as a juvenile. She was 14 at the time. Was a very, very different view of trauma than somebody would have maybe as they get older and reflect back on a time in childhood. You know, developing brains don't continue, or they continue to grow and mature, some say till 25, but I've met some adults that I still don't think are there. 25, 26 for brain maturity. And so there's just so much growth in terms of understanding your own experiences that happens after that time to cause them to be able to write off some of those traumatic experiences as they couldn't possibly have been traumatic if they were necessary. We'll go row by row. So
kind of piggybacking on Suzanne's question, did the teen mothers know that the visitors were also keeping a concurrent ACE score? Or was that something that was, I don't want to say withheld from them, but were they aware that that was happening?
They were made aware that anything they disclosed would be kept in their file, that they would have the ability to see their file anytime they requested it, and they knew that there was a section in their file that had their survey, and there was also a section on the opposite side was one for the home visitor. Now, I don't know how often they actually requested to go back and compare the two. I do know that several of the home visitors told me that the teen occasionally, because they knew they had taken that survey, would ask the home visitor, "I need you to bring that survey back. I've got to update mine." And so the teens were aware, even though they weren't necessarily tracking what the home visitor was keeping their score as, but they would sometimes request to update their own score. Gertrude. We don't know yet how long it can continue. And some research has been more recent, and a lot of the research that is coming out that kind of addresses that is only looking at mice, because again, we can't set up experiments for this. But when the genetic change results in a behavior or a modification that is adaptive, meaning it does what it was meant to do, then it is more likely to persist in generations beyond generations 3 and 4, unless a new trauma occurs that turns off that particular gene. But if the genetic trait is maladaptive or doesn't do what it's meant to do, so like in the Dutch hunger winter, those babies, their genes basically said, okay, right now we're inside our mom and the world is safe even though we're starving. So we are going to reprogram part of this blueprint to help our bodies hold on to food and to actually slow metabolisms down. And it wound up, if you go look at people in the Netherlands, there is a distinct body type that reflects this time and has actually been studied and documented pretty thoroughly. But it was because the trait that actually arose from the DNA modification didn't serve the same purpose once the baby was born, because the famine was over. And so the baby's body had been programmed to conserve calories and to have a very slow metabolism, but they were not in starvation situations. And so the obesity rates went through the roof for these babies and also for their children. And that continues to be seen today in their population. So those things continue to persist, and in some cases is at the 4th and 5th and 6th generation. Yeah.
So you studied ages 11 to 17.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on when do these things emerge? Like, do you think there's a correlation between, the emergence of at-risk behaviors for younger children? Like, do you think that can be used to understand why younger children are withdrawn or maybe seem depressed? Or what are your thoughts? Like, when do you think that actually emerges? Like, could we use it to understand elementary age children and their behaviors in class?
I'm gonna choose my words carefully. I think that we make a lot of assumptions about children's behavior and assume that there must be something wrong with the child. But perhaps the child's behavior was one of the adaptations that it was given based on the environment that it was born into. So, for example, there have been studies that were not causal by any means, but were looking for just relationships. And children that had been born into, well, not just the children, but also their parents, that had been born into environments that were chaotic or in unstable housing situations and dangerous communities. They were born with a heightened sense of fight or flight. They were born with bodies that were busier. And in environments that are unstable and in environments that are risky, those are actually protective behaviors for that child. It's protective for the child to be alert. It is protective for the child to see and be able to take in a lot of information at a time. It's protective for the child to be constantly aware and moving. But what happens is we take children whose bodies have been programmed to live in their home environments, and then we put them in a school setting that we have designed to only really reflect kind of one person or one group's view of what's appropriate. And we call all these behaviors that actually serve them very, very well in their home environments, we call them in a school setting maladaptive. We say they're, detrimental and harmful, when yet in their home environments, they are behaviors that are going to help them live and persist and be contributing members to that environment. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but Cindy? I think it could, depending on the family's response to it. If the family reacted in ways that increased, if the family was very, very stressed by COVID, because basically the underlying mechanism for all of this is toxic stress and cortisol and the hormones that get released when our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis gets kicked into high gear. And so when that happens, when we encounter something that is very, very stressful, we have these hormone responses. And for it to only happen once is a great thing. So if you're walking through the woods and a tree starts to fall, your brain responds and it releases all of these hormones all at once, and it causes you to get out of the way or run or panic, but we react based on these hormones. And so we need them in our life. But when we constantly are in a state of having to walk through the forest and dodge trees, there comes a point where those things are no longer serving us in a way that is healthy, and it begins to do damage to our response systems, and that's when our DNA begins to be rewritten. So yeah, things like COVID, if the family responded in ways that were highly stressful, or the family reacted with, extreme stress, then we could certainly see those kinds of things playing out in kids and grandkids, and yeah. Dr. Droge.
Two questions. One, if you study or studies that have been done, take into account the impact of other intervening variables
Yes.
like socioeconomic
Mhm.
factors, ethnicities, region.
I controlled for region, socioeconomics, just to play around. I controlled for gender. I controlled for the age of the mother at every range up to the age of 18. And family stability over the last 12 months. Many other studies, because in social science research, that's really one of the only mechanisms we have to provide any control into some of these studies, is to use statistical methods to do that, because we don't have the benefit of being able to set up true experimental design. And so most of the studies that look at this using human populations do have to use statistical methods to build in the controls, and they do. However, there is also a very active body of research being done by biologists and epigeneticists that do this similar type studies or set up very controlled studies using mice, and that actually becomes the framework for things that is being looked at in social science research. So we see what happens biologically, and they'll look at brain scans and all kinds of things in the mice and how they reacted to stress and how they reacted to certain situations, and then they'll look at their babies and later offspring. So they can set up very controlled experiments with the mice. And then we take those models that have been demonstrated in a lot of the mice studies and try and overlap them onto existing populations of humans. We can't set up the experiment, but we then try and attempt to use experimental or statistical controls to control for as much as you can. We can't do a lot of that with humans.
So the second question is, are you aware whether there are therapies, treatments that have been developed to help people with high resistance scores?
There are many, 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 many different models that are currently emerging for trauma-informed care. And they attempt to acknowledge what the child brings to the table, to acknowledge where he is at, to try and recognize which of the behaviors that may be considered problematic also are serving him in some productive way in a different environment, and not necessarily extinguish those, because you don't want him to go home and be unsafe, but try and find ways to bridge the gap. But we currently have no treatment for a lot of the traits that we see. One of the best treatments, and I guess one of the reasons that we talk about it, is by being aware of how this type of environment affects young children. Hopefully, as adults, we can create better environments for young children that are safer and less risky. And therefore, moving forward, perhaps we can raise generations of children who will have lower scores. I will also say, this list of 10 is not the only list. There are, now that this research has been going on for a couple of decades, there are a ton of lists. And it doesn't really matter what's on the list. All that matters is kind of the cumulative score. How risky, or how much trauma did you have? It doesn't matter which ones. So it doesn't matter if it's just these 10. If you had 9 of these plus a really stressful COVID experience, it could still result in the same type of risk factors as scoring an additional +1 on the original ACE survey. Mm-hmm.
So it may not matter, because everybody's experience is subjective, but like in the instructions for the ACE survey, did they try to operationalize the word often? Like did they give them instructions on, is that once a month, is it once a year, like is one person's often, is another person's not often?
No.
And it may not have mattered, I just was curious if they did that.
What you saw in the slide right before I started showing you the questions was the actual survey. And so the instructions basically said that put a check mark by each statement that happened to you prior to your 18th birthday. And so there was a great deal of subjectivity just built into the survey. And there was nobody there to even give instructions. These surveys were mailed out. So they mailed out 25,000 or so, 22,000 I think the first time, and got back 17,000, which is highly impressive. But there was nobody there at the time to provide more context, to answer any questions. It's how they interpreted that, and yet even with no context being provided or no clarification what often or very often meant, they were still able to draw some pretty clear relationships between later health risks and the responses. Yeah.
Is there a difference in, like, if an ACE score point is received at a very young age, like 1, versus 17?
There have been several studies recently to try and break some of those things apart, because original research was not looking at that. But some of the work that has been done recently has been trying to identify if windows of opportunity, if trauma happens during these specific times, does it make it a bigger deal? And so far, those results aren't really showing a whole lot of difference. It's really it's the number more than anything during those formative years, which right now they've given a pretty broad window of birth to 18. Now, I will say if your parent went to prison and you were 6 months old, a lot of people would originally have argued, well, you wouldn't have even known that that was happening. The issue is not so much the day that somebody left to go to prison. It's what happens in your household from that point forward creates stress in your family and creates stress that continues to reoccur and creates an environment where there are repeated things that happen that are stressful for you. It might not have been just that one act of the parent leaving to go to prison, but the environment that is created once that has happened, that will continue. And so it's the continued exposure, it's the continuing activation of that adrenal axis, that hormone dump in your head that happens over time, that continues to cause the problem. So back to your original question, is there a time some of that research is just now happening? The first efforts at it haven't been real conclusive and haven't showed real strong relationships, but I imagine they're going to look at it in some different ways, and I'll be interested to see what comes out of it. We'll go back there and then come to front. Yes, ma'am.
You said that DNA trauma, if a new trauma was inflicted, that would return, we can change DNA.
Yes.
Positive, like something positive, like a complete, like
Yes, yes. So positive things can also cause stress. Somebody getting married can still be very stressful. Having a new baby can still be very stressful. Things that we internalize as such positives in our lives can still be very stressful. And so we still have this response that happens in our system. But we find that the body somehow, and we still don't know a whole lot about these mechanisms yet, but the body tries to take the information that is received and then alter the DNA blueprint. So again, we're not completely changing DNA, we're just turning genes on and turning genes off. The body then tries to react to that so that the next generation will be prepared for this thing. If that was a good thing, it's going to try and prepare your offspring for that. If it's a really negative thing, it's going to try and prepare your offspring for that. And so one of the strategies, somebody asked, maybe that was Suzanne, you asked what are some of the ways that we try and deal with this. There is a whole body of research right now who's trying to figure out what are these good things. Can we socially engineer these really great, exciting things to offset some of these behaviors? And one of the issues they are running into, just like we know that it doesn't really matter what the 10 traumas are, it's just the accumulation of them. It doesn't really matter what the good things are. What really matters is the accumulation of the good things, just like the accumulation of the bad things. One of the only things that has been shown to really move the needle at all in terms of positivity is having at least one consistent, stable adult in the life of the child who, for lack of better words, genuinely thinks that baby hung the moon. That can change everything. Mm-hmm.
A child that was born, let's say, to a mother that had like this risky sexual behavior, like was pregnant and drug use, like pregnant. What is some of the things that showing up in children like that? What is the way that they have their bodies when they're being that old and preparing to deal with that?
Well, first of all, when it comes to risky sexual behavior and drug use, those things kind of are a double-edged sword. Partly because with drug use, there's the potential for the drug to actually have influenced the baby while the mom was pregnant. And the risky sexual behavior can come with various STDs or internal traumas that could have injured the baby. And so those would kind of be physical insults, you might say, to the baby. That would be separate things from the DNA type issues. Now, the mom engaging in those risky behaviors is a reaction very often to things that happen to her or to her grandmother. And so the baby is this is more clearly at the moment seen in my studies, but the mom's risky behavior is probably a direct reaction, not probably, is more likely to be a direct reaction to what occurred in a generation before her. But what we see in offspring is usually a lower stress response, kind of what I showed you, which one, not the Dutch, the Holocaust. So we expect the mom to have big reactive behaviors because she is reacting to some type of trauma. But in her offspring, we expect to see a lower type response to that. And so that often results in higher rates of depression in those children when they grow up, higher rates of suicidal tendencies, higher rates of mental health issues or needing types of mental health support. And it's basically the mom was living in an environment that was chaotic and was causing big emotional responses. And so her DNA blueprint basically said, we're going to live in a really, really stressful place. So we need to make sure that our baby can live in a really, really stressful place by having really, really mellow responses. But when the baby is born, that winds up in a lot of cases, or the baby's more likely to show behaviors in these mellow responses that do increase the chances for depression and things like that. Well, I appreciate there's one more hand. Mm-hmm.
Piggyback on what you just said, does it matter the age of the mom, like when she had a baby, that
if the mom experienced traumas, well, and I guess in my own study, it didn't really matter. I did some types of analysis where I was controlling for the different ages of the mom, and I really didn't see any variance in the outcomes for the babies based on the age of the mom, and the ages were 11 to 18. Now, we know there are some amazing teen moms, and there are some adult moms who just struggle and never really get it together. It seems that the greater predictor of success for the baby is what happened to the mom, not so much her age, but kind of her traumas. What were the things, what's the baggage that she was carrying when she had a baby, and what caused her to be in a situation, that risky sexual behavior. That's probably part of how she got pregnant as a teenager in the first place. There was already some of those behaviors playing out when she got pregnant. And so we see, but it doesn't necessarily mean that a teen mom is going to have more trouble. It just means that there was already some stuff going on, and that's why she was in the situation, or it could have contributed to that situation to begin with. Well, I thank you for your time and your attention, and it's been fun, y'all. Thanks.